Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're cracking open the Detective's Toolkit Decoding Biblical Hermeneutics. Now, have you ever actually wondered how scholars go about systematically decoding one of the most massive, multi-layered ancient libraries ever written? Because, let's be real for a second, trying to read texts that old without a proper framework, it's kind of like trying to assemble a million-piece IKEA furniture set in the pitch dark without the manual. I mean, sure, you might get a couple of pieces to snap together, but the big picture is going to be an absolute mess. So today, we're diving into the ultimate investigative methodology that's specifically designed to make sense of all of it. Think about it like this. How do you decode a 2,000-year-old puzzle? Just picture trying to piece together this massive dossier written by dozens of different people over thousands of years living in completely different ancient cultures. How do you even begin to interpret something that vast and intricate without just getting totally lost in the weeds? Because if you just crack open a random page and start reading, you're pretty much guaranteed to miss the overarching narrative. And that dilemma right there is exactly why a highly structured investigative framework is absolutely essential. You literally need a dedicated methodology to trace complex themes, properly understand the historical context, and decode these deeply layered symbols without losing your way. And that brings us to the very core of our explainer today, biblical hermeneutics. Now, according to the source material we're looking at, this isn't just some casual reading guide. It is a rigid, systematic set of principles used as a rigorous methodology to interpret ancient religious texts. You can think of it as a master key, or actually, better yet, think of it as the ultimate investigator's decoder ring. Our source breaks this whole methodology down into 7 distinct principles of interpretation, 7 highly specific tools designed to help you expertly navigate every single page of this complex text. So here's our investigative roadmap for today. We're going to explore this framework in 4 core phases. 1. The aforementioned principles. 2. The divine program. 3. Mapping the timeline. And 4. The Christocentric focus. Let's kick things off with phase 1, the aforementioned principles, which is all about tracing the clues. This first group of tools focuses entirely on tracking how specific concepts, events, and symbols evolve across the ancient text. It's this incredibly systematic way of reading that basically forces the interpreter to constantly look backwards and forwards. The framework treats these textual ideas as a connected life cycle. Step 1 is the first mention, acting as the seed. Step 2 is the progressive mention, which represents the gradual growth or the successive unfolding of that idea over time. And then step 3 is the complete mention, the harvest. And the logic here is that you simply cannot understand the harvest if you don't know what seed was planted in the first place, right? Our source insists that because truth is progressively unfolded in this text, no single verse contains the whole truth on any given theme. You really have to investigate the entire life cycle. If we look a little closer at that very first step, the source defines a first mention as a seed containing the full truth that is to be developed in all subsequent mentions. Now, this methodology operates on the premise of a single overarching divine author who intentionally plants the defining characteristics of a subject in its very first appearance. It's a genuinely fascinating concept. For example, before the actual word believe is formally used over in Genesis 15, the underlying concept of faith is vividly demonstrated all the way back in Genesis 3. So the foundational seed of the idea is planted and defined way before the sprout is actually given a proper name. And that leads us to the 4th specific tool in this grouping, the comparative mention principle. This rule dictates that a verse or a concept can really only be fully interpreted by comparing or contrasting it with another verse on the exact same subject. You do this to make their distinct differences vividly marked. A prime example in the text is contrasting the first Adam, who is tied directly to the origin of sin and death, with the last Adam, who is tied to redemption and life. By putting these profoundly differing concepts side by side, the methodology forces the investigator to clearly define the unique characteristics of each. It turns abstract theology into a really clear, side-by-side comparative study. All right, moving right along to phase 2, the divine program, the master plan. So once you know how to meticulously trace specific words and concepts, you kind of have to zoom out. This phase is all about looking at the underlying master plan that's shaping the whole narrative. The framework analyzes the text through 3 distinct macro lenses. First up is the election principle. This is analyzing who is sovereignly selected or chosen for a specific purpose in time or eternity. Second is the covenantal principle, which looks at the specific binding agreements or contracts made between God and man. And third is the ethnic division principle, identifying exactly which distinct groups are interacting within the text. And here's the thing. If you miss even one of these lenses, like if you don't know who is chosen, what contract they're operating under, and what group they belong to, it completely alters the interpretation of the text. So the stakes of this investigation remain incredibly high. Let's drill down into that second lens for a second, the covenants. Understanding the exact nature of these divine contracts is absolutely crucial. The methodology divides them strictly into two categories. You have unconditional covenants, which are initiated purely by God, regardless of any human response at all. In the text, you'll see the definitive formula, I will. Think of the gravity of the Noahic covenant, right? A promise made entirely unilaterally. Conditional covenants, on the other hand, depend entirely on human obedience. They carry the much heavier burden of the formula, if, then, much like the Mosaic covenant. Knowing exactly which of these two contracts applies to a specific ancient text is a massive, indispensable key to unlocking its intended meaning. Right alongside those binding contracts, the text systematically categorizes humanity into three distinct ethnic divisions. You have the chosen nation, which is Israel, the Gentile nations, referring to all other nations outside of that specific covenant, and eventually, when you get to the New Testament era, the Holy Nation, or the Church, which is composed of individuals from both. Applying this tool dictates exactly how specific passages should be interpreted based entirely on the intended audience. Our promise made to one specific group under one specific contract cannot just be universally applied to everyone else. In fact, applying the wrong promise to the wrong demographic is treated as a huge mistake, a cardinal sin, really, in this investigative framework.
That brings us to Phase 3, mapping the timeline, the chronometrical principle.
So if you have the concepts traced, and you clearly know the contracts and the people involved, you still need to know exactly when you are. In this analytical tool, time itself is treated not just as a dry record of history, but as a carefully designed fragment of eternity. The methodology maps this massive narrative chronologically across three overarching eras. You have the past ages, spanning roughly 4,000 years from creation to Christ, then the present age, the New Testament era that's been running for the last 2,000 years or so, and finally, the future ages, spanning infinite years into eternity. The interpreter's job is basically like dropping a pin on a massive GPS map of history to locate exactly where a specific event or prophecy sits on this overarching timeline.
But time in this methodology isn't always a straight, unbroken line. Enter a pretty fascinating subrule, the breach principle. A breach is essentially a gap or an interruption in prophetic time or promise fulfillment. According to the source, this break is often caused by human rebellion, such as Israel's delayed entry into the Promised Land, which effectively added a 40-year gap to the timeline. Or, a breach can be caused by prophetic perspective, where an ancient writer looks into the future and sees two distant events as one, with an entirely unseen gap of time stretching between them. Recognizing these hidden breaches is absolutely critical to solving the timeline puzzles without getting thrown completely off course.
And finally, we hit Phase 4, the Christocentric focus, the ultimate motive. After tracing all the clues, analyzing the binding contracts, and carefully mapping out the timeline, the entire investigation points toward one singular focal point. It's the absolute climax of our investigator's toolkit. The source material states it plainly, with this sweeping directive: find Christ in all the scriptures. According to this specific hermeneutical framework, the ultimate goal of all interpretation is to present this central figure as the grand solution. So whether he's being spoken of prophetically back in the past ages, historically in the present age, or symbolically through ancient covenants, this entire massive library is viewed as revolving entirely around this one individual. Applying this final principle means that the ultimate measure of successfully decoding the text isn't just about accumulating academic knowledge. It's not just an intellectual exercise. The framework actually defines its metrics of success by whether the interpretation accomplishes 5 very specific things. Does it reveal a deep human need? Does it present the grand solution to that need? Does it make this central figure more real to the reader? Does it increase confidence in the text itself? And finally, does it cause a longing for this figure's return? In this rigorous methodology, the analysis is only considered complete when the investigator fully connects the textual clues back to the central person they were designed to comprehensively reveal.
Well, we've unpacked an incredibly dense set of rules today, from tracing foundational seeds of thought, to tracking divine contracts, to mapping chronological breaches. Whether you are dealing with ancient religious texts, complex historical documents, or even just your own daily reading, having a rigid framework like this turns random guessing into calculated discovery. So I'll leave you with this. How might bringing a highly structured, systematic toolkit completely revolutionize the way you read and understand the world's most complex literature?